For decades, the story has been told a certain way. Two jet fighters, one German and one British, the very first of their kind, streaking toward each other across the ruined skies of Europe in the closing months of the Second World War. The opening duel of the Jet Age. It is a wonderful image. It is also completely false. The German Messerschmitt jet and the British Gloster Meteor never once fought each other, not a single time. And the only Allied jet to see combat in the entire war actually spent most of its days chasing something far stranger than an enemy fighter. Its real story is nothing like the legend, and in some ways, it is better. The Gloster Meteor was born from one of the great quiet revolutions of the 20th century. For years, a British engineer named Frank Whittle had been championing an idea that many in authority found hard to take seriously, that an aircraft did not need a propeller at all, that it could be pushed through the sky by a jet of hot gas. The piston engines that powered every fighter of the era were reaching the limits of what they could do. To go faster, you needed a bigger, heavier engine turning a bigger propeller, until eventually the propeller itself became the problem, thrashing the air as it approached the speed of sound and losing its grip. The jet offered a way past that wall entirely, and a handful of stubborn people on both sides of the war understood that whoever crossed it first would own the future of flight. By the early years of the war, Whittle's persistence had produced a working jet engine, and the Gloster Aircraft Company was handed the job of building an airframe to carry it. There was, however, a catch. Those first jet engines were not yet powerful enough for a single one to haul a fighter into battle on its own. So the designers made a simple, pragmatic decision that would define the entire aircraft. They would use two engines instead of one, cradled in the wings on either side of the pilot. The result took to the air in early 1943, and it was named the Meteor. What made the Meteor special was not that it was the fastest or most advanced machine in the sky, because it was neither. What made it special was that it worked, and that it was safe enough to be trusted to ordinary squadron pilots. That sounds like faint praise. It is actually the entire point of the aircraft. The men who designed the Meteor made a deliberate choice to be conservative. While German engineers were chasing radical shapes, swept-back wings, and cutting-edge aerodynamics that pushed into the unknown, the British team gave the Meteor straight, conventional wings and a sturdy, forgiving airframe. This made it slower than it might otherwise have been. It made it less glamorous on paper. But it also made it reliable, predictable, and controllable, and its engines, while still primitive, held together far better than the temperamental German jets that were forever burning out and breaking down. The philosophy behind the Meteor was that a good jet you can actually fly is worth more than a brilliant jet that keeps falling out of the sky and killing the man inside it. This was engineering for the real world rather than for the drawing board. The pilot sat well forward with an excellent view, the two engines buried in the wings beside him, and a punch of 4 cannon in the nose. It was not a machine that would dazzle anyone with its numbers. It was a machine that would start, take off, do its job, and bring its pilot home again. In a war full of beautiful designs that killed the very men who flew them, that ordinary dependability was rarer and far more valuable than it sounds. The Meteor entered service in the summer of 1944, and its first enemy was neither a fighter nor a bomber. It was a flying bomb. Germany had begun raining down the V-1, an early cruise missile, a small pilotless aircraft packed with explosives that buzzed across the English Channel and fell without warning on London. The British called them Doodlebugs, and they were terrifying precisely because there was no pilot to kill and no mercy to appeal to. They flew fast and low and dead straight, and running them down stretched even the finest piston fighters to their limit. The Meteor, fast and modern, was one of the very few aircraft that could reliably catch them. And so the first mission of the world's newest jet fighter became the strange and dangerous work of hunting robots over the English countryside. In one of the most famous incidents of the whole campaign, a Meteor pilot closed on a flying bomb only for his cannon to jam at the critical moment. Rather than let it through to the city waiting behind him, he flew up alongside it, carefully slid his wingtip beneath the bomb's own wing, and tipped it over, sending it tumbling harmlessly out of the sky. It was audacious. It was uniquely a piece of jet age flying, and it captured everything odd and unexpected about the Meteor's war. Later, in the final months of the conflict, Meteors were at last sent across to the continent, based in Belgium and the Netherlands, where they flew ground attack and reconnaissance missions against a collapsing Germany. But here we reach perhaps the strangest fact of all. For a long time, the Meteor had been deliberately kept away from combat over enemy-held territory. The British High Command was terrified that one might be shot down or forced to crash land in enemy hands, giving the other side a chance to strip its engines and copy them. So the most advanced fighter Britain possessed spent months held on a leash, forbidden from doing the very thing it had been built to do. And this brings us back to the legend we began with. The popular imagination loves to picture the Gloster Meteor and the German Messerschmitt jet as rivals, two gunslingers of the new jet age squaring off high over Europe. The truth is that they never met in battle, not once. They operated in different places, under different orders and different restrictions. And the great jet versus jet duel of the Second World War, the one so many documentaries imply, simply never took place. It is a myth assembled entirely in hindsight, purely because the two aircraft looked as though they ought to have fought. When people do compare the two honestly, the Meteor usually comes off as the lesser machine, and in raw performance that judgment is fair. The German jet was faster, more heavily armed, and more daring in its shape. But this comparison quietly misses what actually mattered in a war. The German jet, for all its genius, was plagued by engines that wore out in a handful of hours and a temperament that killed inexperienced pilots on takeoff and landing. The Meteor, slower and plainer, could be flown, serviced, and trusted day after day. In the hard arithmetic of war, an aircraft that flies every morning beats a masterpiece that sits broken in a hangar. There is one more piece of the legend that needs handling with care. The Meteor is often called the only Allied jet of the war, and in the sense that matters most, that is true. It was the only Allied jet aircraft to actually reach the front and fire its guns in anger. But it was not the only one that existed. The United States had its own jet fighters in development and testing during those same years. They simply never made it into combat before the fighting stopped. So the Meteor's distinction is genuine, but it is the distinction of being the one that arrived in time, not the only one anyone managed to build. Put all of this together, and the honest verdict is clear. The Gloster Meteor was not a war-winning weapon. It arrived late, it was held back for months, and its combat record in the Second World War amounts mostly to knocking down flying bombs and strafing an enemy that was already beaten. As a fighting machine in that particular war, its impact was minor, and no serious account should pretend otherwise. And yet its real importance lies almost entirely in what came afterward. Because Britain had put a working, reliable jet into service, and had built up a whole generation of pilots and mechanics who understood these strange new machines, the country stepped into the post-war world with a genuine head start in the jet age. In the years that followed, developed versions of the Meteor shattered the world airspeed record, pushing past 600 miles per hour and announcing to everyone that the age of the propeller was truly over. The aircraft went on to serve for decades, was sold to air forces all around the globe, and even fought again years later in the skies over Korea, where it was by then outclassed as a dogfighter but still useful as a ground attack machine. It was, in the end, one of the longest-serving and most widely flown jets of its whole generation. The Meteor, then, was not the climax of anything. It was a beginning. It was the sturdy, sensible, slightly unglamorous aircraft that carried Britain across the threshold from one age of flight into the next, and it did so without killing the men who flew it. So the true story of the Gloster Meteor turns out to be almost the opposite of the legend. It was not a dazzling superfighter locked in a duel with its German rival. It was a careful, modest, deliberately unspectacular machine, built by people who chose reliability over glory, and were proven right. It never got its great heroic battle, and the strange truth is that it never needed one. Its achievement was quieter, and in its way more lasting. It flew when it was asked to. It brought its pilots home, and it held the door open to everything that came after. Sometimes the machine that changes the world is not the one that wins the famous fight. It is the one that simply, reliably works.